Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So there's been some movement on the FCC Broadband Maps. Their preliminary map fabric is out, and we'll talk about that today. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So one of the things we're all waiting on is the new broadband maps. The FCC has to get out new maps before a significant portion of the funding that's waiting as far as the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Before that money can be released, we need to know which areas of the country, specifically very down to the address, which areas are served and unserved. And from that, then they will determine, based on each state, how many unserved and served areas they have. And then from that, they will determine kind of a ratio of the money as it gets split out among the states and territories. So we're waiting on that. Unserved would be any area that does not have broadband that's at least 25 by 3. Underserved is an area that's not at least 100 by 20. And again, before we can tell what that is, we need to get these maps. And before we get the maps, we need to have the service providers load their data into a system that's called the fabric, the map fabric, basically. So that, what the FCC now has come out with is the preliminary broadband fabric. This is preliminary, but they are still encouraging service providers to go ahead and start looking at this and then basically kind of experimenting with it, making sure that they understand how everything's going to work, how they're going to be able to load stuff, because there's a specific time frame that service providers have in order to get all of their information in there, or there could be penalties, fines. So they want to make sure that everybody's kind of looking at this preliminary stuff, making sure they understand it, get used to it, even though there can be changes between the preliminary and the production fabric. So this is what we're going to look at today. And we'll take a look at the public notice from the FCC. So you see here, Broadband Data Task Force announces access to preliminary broadband serviceable location fabric to fixed service providers and guidance for filling fixed broadband availability data. So they say here, by this public notice, the Broadband Data Task Force, Wireline Competition Bureau, and Office of Economics Analytics announce that fixed broadband service providers may now access a preliminary version of the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, or the Fabric, to assist them in preparing their broadband availability data for the broadband data collection. So again, this is to help them get ready to be able to do this when they actually are able to submit to the production. You can see I don't have it highlighted, but the dates on this are June 30th through September 1st, 2022. So that's the dates when the production fabric is supposed to be up, and they need to get their data in there between that time frame. But they have access now to this preliminary fabric to kind of get used to this. So specifically, this public notice provides information for providers of fixed broadband service on how to access the preliminary fabric, identifies the data sources used in and elements of the fabric, confirms that the fabric will identify broadband serviceable locations using a unique commission-issued identifier, or location ID, a set of latitude, longitude coordinates within the boundaries of each structure, and where feasible, a street address. Now, notice it says where feasible. And number 4 specifies that fixed broadband providers that do not use availability polygons must submit their broadband availability data using the unique location IDs in the fabric. So polygon, they mentioned that several times in here. A polygon would be, what it sounds like. So it's basically an area defined, by lines that would encompass all of the addresses in a particular area that they serve. So it's still got to be down to the address, but that polygon is something that would be used by a GIS system, a mapping system, to determine exactly where those locations are. So they can submit that through polygons. They can do it that way. If they don't, there's going to be a location ID associated with each serviceable location. Now, again, they're going to try to get address information there as well, but there's going to be a location ID. It's like a 8-digit number or something they mentioned in here somewhere. That's going to be, and it's actually different for the preliminary and the production version. So the location IDs are going to change. But there's a location ID that will determine the locations, or again, they can submit it through the polygon. But if they're going to do it by addresses, they're going to have to go and kind of match up the addresses that they serve with what the location IDs are from the FCC. Pursuant to the BDA, Broadband Data Act, fixed broadband providers can report broadband availability data using either 1, availability polygons, or 2, a list of addresses or locations. Now, it's interesting that it's a list of addresses because it says they have to use the location ID, so this was a little confusing. And in both cases, the availability data will be reported on the BDC maps on a location basis tied to the fabric such that consumers and state, local, and tribal governments and other third parties can view and, if applicable, submit challenges to the data. So first step, get all of the broadband data in the fabric, then the maps will be available where you can actually go in there like human beings, go in there and look and see where stuff is on a map as opposed to just a big table of data. The Commission determined that the fabric will consist of a single nationwide data set that will contain geocoded locations for all locations where a broadband connection can be installed. So that's where that would be a serviceable location. So they're not going to have like parking lots in here. It's wherever you can install. They mention in here things like marinas and other places that don't have power. So there's some information about that in here if you want to look through that. I'm going to go ahead and post a copy of this, where you can get this, as well as the site that's got the fabric. So I'll post a couple links here at the end. In the third report in order, the Commission adopted additional details about the fabric, including adopting a definition of location for purposes of the fabric as a business or residential location in the United States at which fixed broadband internet access service is or can be installed. Determining that the fabric will reflect each location as a single point defined by a set of geographic coordinates that fall within the footprint of a building. Declining to commit to a specific role for address data until we are able to determine the types of data and functionality that will be available through the fabric procurement process. So again, the address stuff's kind of up in the air. Determining to use definitions of residential and business locations that are based on the definitions of those terms as used in connection with the Connect America Fund with certain modifications. And then also determining to identify a multi-tenant environment as a single location record in the fabric, and to the extent feasible, to associate the number of units within each MTE with the MTE's location information in the fabric. So if you have an apartment building or an office building, that's going to be one location, and they'll hopefully try to say, well, there's 75 units in this apartment building, that kind of thing. It mentions here again, the information about ensuring that locations such as marinas, mobile home parks, and homes without electric power reflect broadband serviceability to the extent they're able to make determinations given the data available. So they talk about that in here. Below, we provide information on how fixed broadband service providers may access the preliminary data, which are currently available for the 50 states and DC. Given the preliminary nature of this data set, some of the values for each location have been omitted. These values will be included in later releases of fabric data. So again, they're reminding everybody that this is preliminary, and this is really just kind of for practice purposes is what it is. This preliminary data set will enable fixed service providers to develop and test their methods to align their broadband availability data with the fabric data format. CostQuest, who they got to do the fabric, and the Commission staff are continuing to refine the location data in the fabric to meet the requirements laid out by the Commission, and expect that the production fabric data will differ from the preliminary data in at least some circumstances, so this will be changing. Nevertheless, by familiarizing themselves with the preliminary data now, fixed broadband service providers can establish and refine methods to align their availability data with the fabric and better position themselves to meet their filing obligations during the initial filing window. So again, practice now so you can do this later when you're required to. We urge filers to use the preliminary fabric data to build a process to prepare their availability data and file early in the filing window. Doing so will afford filers an opportunity to make any necessary corrections in advance of the September 1 deadline to assure that their submission is timely filed. As we stated when we announced that the inaugural BDC filing window will open on June 30th, 2022. It mentions here that accurate and timely submission of BDC data is mandatory for covered broadband service providers. Access to preliminary fabric data. The preliminary version of the fabric is currently available for access by fixed broadband service providers that filed fixed broadband deployment data in past Form 477 filings. So every service provider has already or has been providing data via these Form 477s to the FCC, and this is the data that's been used for prior maps, and it was not good because it was based on a census block, maybe even a census block group, I can't recall, but basically it was not down to the address, it was like an entire census block, and if you were serving one location in that census block, it was considered served. So that was bad. So, but the 477 filings will determine who will have access to this preliminary fabric data. Each company's data will contain Fabric records only for the counties that overlap the census blocks reported in the filer's Form 477 fixed broadband deployment data. Eligible fixed broadband service providers must execute a license agreement with CostQuest in order to access the data. CostQuest will send an email to the email address of the certifying individual of each June 2021 Form 477 filing with fixed broadband deployment, so the last time that was filed, requesting that the recipient visit CostQuest user support help desk to, number 1, create user credentials, and 2, submit a license request form, and 3, execute the licensing agreement. And then they've got the email address here that it's going to come from. And they recommend people make sure that they're looking for emails from that address, make sure that it doesn't go in spam folders, that kind of thing. The first step in the process after receiving an email from CostQuest will be for the entity to create a user account, username and password, within CostQuest user support help desk system. Once user credentials are created, the entity must then access and complete a license request form. The individual who completes the license request form must be the same person who will sign the license agreement. So that's important, that if you're going to be creating the license request form, you also need to be the person signing it. After the license request form is submitted, the user will receive a confirmation email from the same email address noted above, confirming receipt of the request. Details of the Fabric, the data sources that will be used by the FCC's vendor to assist in identifying the locations, including broadband serviceable locations. Listed in the Fabric include a mix of satellite imagery, building footprints, address databases, land and local tax records, and other sources that the vendor finds as either necessary or beneficial for determining, as completely as possible, the locations of structures throughout the United States where fixed broadband service can be installed. So again, that's the big piece that they've been doing here, is trying to figure out what are all of the broadband serviceable locations in this country. And it mentions here how they're, the different things different data sets that they're including local tax records, building footprints, etc. The initial production version of the Fabric will include the following data elements for each broadband serviceable location. This is the production version. First, a commission-issued unique location ID, and 2, the location IDs, or the location's latitude and longitude coordinates, which fall within the boundaries of the structure, and 3, address data for each location if feasible. Each broadband serviceable location will include data for latitude, longitude, coordinates, and where feasible, an address, same thing that's said there. So that providers can identify the broadband serviceable location to which the location ID applies. So again, there'll be a location ID, and then hopefully you can match that up with an address. The production Fabric will further include data including whether a location is residential, non-residential, or both residential and non-residential. An estimated unit cost for the location, unit count again like a apartment building, and additional information to help filers associate Fabric points with their data. Fixed service providers that submit list-based broadband availability data must associate each of their broadband serviceable locations to a specific location ID. So if you're serving a subscriber in a particular location, you're going to have to match that up with a location ID. And again, that location ID is going to be determined by all of these buildings and tax records, those kinds of things. Using the location ID as the required data element for identifying broadband serviceable locations will greatly simplify the use of the Fabric by filers, the Commission, and other stakeholders, and will ensure more accurate availability data because providers will not have to match or include any other variables, including addresses, when making their broadband availability filings. I don't know, still seems harder to me, but notice here it says filers should be aware that the location IDs in the preliminary version of the Fabric will not be the same as the location IDs in the production version of the Fabric. So again, you're going to go through all of this stuff and figure it out, but it's all going to be wiped clean, and then you'll start over with the production Fabric, but hopefully you'll know most of the things that you have to do. Consequently, we encourage filers to use the preliminary version of the Fabric to gain an understanding of the format of the Fabric data and the elements that are or will be included in it, and to develop processes for conforming their data with the Fabric, looking at your addresses or whatever and getting them synced up with location IDs or your polygons. For this reason, CostQuest will only provide support for licensing and accessing the preliminary data, at least until such time as the production version of the Fabric is made available to filers. So they're only supporting the preliminary one right now. Fixed broadband service providers availability reporting requirements. As noted above, fixed broadband service providers that do not report using availability polygons must submit their broadband availability data using location IDs that match the unique commission-issued location IDs in the production version of the fabric. Fixed providers will have access to the preliminary version of the fabric immediately, and that's available now, subject to the process described above and to the production version of the fabric as far in advance of June 30th, 2022 as feasible. So sounds like the filing window starts on June 30th, but that you may have access, if you're a service provider, you may have access to the production version of the fabric prior to that. Now, whether they'll let you submit data prior to that, I don't know, but maybe that will give you an idea of what's changed. We note that fixed providers will have the ability to challenge any broadband serviceable location data in the production version of the fabric. So this is not based on the preliminary version that you have access to now, that they believe is an error, so only the production version. And we will provide details on the process for these challenges in a later public notice. Fibers seeking to submit lists of addresses or locations as opposed to submitting availability polygons will need to match their location data to locations in the fabric using those location IDs. Requiring filers to submit the commission-issued location ID for each of their broadband serviceable locations ensures the commission will collect fixed available data that can be geo-referenced to the data in the fabric and will result in a more accurate and complete broadband locations database. So these location IDs will all be kind of synced up with a map as opposed to just trying to use addresses. As stated above, we urge providers of fixed broadband service to access the preliminary data set as soon as possible. Filing broadband availability data based upon the fabric is a new process, so we expect it will take providers some time to work through their methodology for aligning their internal served location data with the fabric, and then to generate the data required for filing in the BDC system. Given that the Commission has already made clear that any request for waivers or extensions of the filing deadline will face a high hurdle, even at the starting gate, we urge fixed broadband service providers to begin this process as quickly as possible. And they warn about that again here. Fixed broadband service providers that submit availability polygons to report their availability must ensure that their polygons include and only include the locations in the fabric to which the filer is providing service, or those to which it could provide service with a standard broadband installation as defined in our rules. So what they're saying there again is these polygons will be something that is GIS data. It's a polygon, area in the map, and it's going to encompass all of these serviceable locations. And only if you're serving that location or currently, or you could service that location. And that doesn't mean that, oh yeah, I'm going to build out fiber next month, or I'm going to start a fiber builder. That means that I already have the ability to serve that location. If somebody wants service, I can set them up, and I believe it might even be that there's like a period of time, like 10 days. So in other words, yeah, I'm going to take an order, I'm going to get them set up in 10 or so days. I'll be out there, get their equipment set up, that kind of thing. That's what they're talking about there. As noted above, let's see, since this is also a new process, we urge providers planning to file a BDC data using availability polygons to start the work of preparing those polygons, ensuring that they meet the requirements adopted by the Commission. So get started on those right away. As noted above, for providers planning to file broadband availability data using the fabric, the Commission has made it clear that any request for waivers or extensions of the filing deadline will face a high hurdle, even at the starting gate, and that a failure to timely file required data in the new BDC system may lead to enforcement action and/or penalties as set forth in the Communications Act and other applicable laws, absent circumstances beyond a filer's control. So this is a mandate. If you're an internet service provider, you are required to do this, and you need to start looking at this preliminary fabric right now so that you can be prepared to file when you need to file. And finally, at the end here, there's information for help. Questions about how to access the preliminary fabric and about the license agreement associated with the fabric should be addressed to support@costquest.zendesk.com. For other information about the preliminary version of the fabric or broadband data collection, please visit the Broadband Data Collection Help Center. It's got a URL right there. So that's the report and order, and then you can go and you can see this is the CostQuest site. This is the vendor that was that the FCC had create this fabric, that's created the preliminary one, and that will be creating the final production one. And then basically on this site, you've got the same basic information on here, so I'm not going to go through all of that. I did note here that, yeah, same thing again. I highlighted that, but it's also, we just read through that. So, and then there's the FCC site where you can download that report and order that I was just going through. So I will post a link to these two items, to this and a link where you can download this this PDF. It won't be all highlighted, but I'll post a link to that. So again, this is good. That means there is movement on this map front. We've got to get these maps out as quickly as possible. And the FCC has said September, which is, it's not going to be September, because the filing deadline is September 1st. Maybe it will be. Maybe they can get all of the data by September 1, and then by the end of September, maybe they can get it all into the map. Because really, again, the hardest part is getting the fabric. Once you have the fabric, you've got all the data, then it's just a matter of putting in a mapping program and it appears on the map. So maybe they can get it out in September. And then, once that's there, you're going to have the open period of challenges back and forth between service providers, some service providers looking at other service providers and saying, wait a minute, you don't have service there, or consumers saying, wait a minute, I don't have 100 meg service at this address. I am challenging that. Could be cities or states or others that are going to be challenging this data. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But again, these maps have got to get out and go through that process, and then they'll take that $42.5 billion. Everybody's going to get $100 million in their preliminary initial money that they're going to get. But anything on top of that, it's going to be based on the number of unserved locations that they have compared to all of the unserved locations in the United States. We won't know that until this map is out. And this map is a moving target because, as I've talked many times on this broadcast, broadband is, whether it's fiber broadband or 5G or wireless, people are installing fiber in the ground as quickly as they can get the fiber and get it in the ground. They're trying to get 5G out as quickly as possible. And each time somebody opens up a territory and does that, then a location that was unserved or underserved becomes served. So this mapping data is going to be changing. It's going to be a moving target. And at some point, they're going to have to put a stake in the ground and say, here's where we are today. And then you'll have challenges going on. And you may have, some of those challenges maybe it's somebody that's got an RDOF award, or they've got an ARPA award, and they have scheduled to have service in a month or two, and they're out deploying it, but they were not able to put it in the fabric because it's not something it's not serviceable today. I think there'll be challenges like that, and then that's going to, again, reduce further the number of unserved locations in the map. So thanks for joining me. If this was helpful, please give me a like on the video, and if you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button, click the little bell, and you'll be notified when I'm live. Thanks a lot, and I will see you tomorrow for Broadband Deployment News. Bye-bye.